All right, part three. Talked about air superiority fighters. We talked about interceptors. We're gonna move on to the next type of fighter. This is, in some ways, the most boring, but I find it more interesting than maybe the average person does. The light fighter. What's a light fighter? It's basically an aircraft that has decent speed, acceleration, high maneuverability, cheap to operate, very quick to deploy, relatively low maintenance compared to its bigger brothers like the air superiority fighter, and it's typically something that's very profitable to sell to international, basically sell internationally on the market. Because it's usually modular, it usually doesn't have a whole lot of stealth capabilities, and it's cheap to manufacture and cheap to maintain. Doctrine. What do you do with the light fighter when you have it? Well, it's a basic patrol. It's a patrol aircraft that's cheap to operate and keep in the air, and the idea is basically be an ever persistent presence to the enemy, particularly if the enemy doesn't have an air force. Basically, you always have this thing up because it's useful and it's light, not a huge payload, but it's good, and they often win in dogfights against simulated dogfights against air superiority fighters because light fighters are smaller and they're harder for the radars to spot. And if you've got a lot of background noise, you've got electronic warfare going on, it's a lot easier for you to slip under the radar and get away when you're a light fighter than you are something with a huge heat signature like a interceptor or air superiority fighter or attacker. Light fighters are basically, when they've got very good technology in them, they're actually a big threat to aircraft like air superiority fighters because of the fact that they usually can get eyes on first. Their sensors will usually pick up the air superiority fighter before the light fighter is picked up by the bigger aircraft, and basically having the lingering threat of these cheap small aircraft that are going to have a lot of basically airtime, and they're going to be a lot. It's going to be a lot easier to train pilots on them. That's what they're used for. They're basically, it's the kind of thing where like a National Guard will show up and like they've got a ton of light fighters, and then that's now a much bigger threat because it's about numbers, it's about ease of operation, it's about ease of training, it's about ease of maintenance. It's basically you are the persistent threat to the enemy. You're always going to be there, and you're inexpensive to operate. Now, sometimes they also are pushed into the coin roll, which is counterinsurgency. Yeah, a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're cheap and they're usually pretty quick, so they're not as vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles. Their payload isn't that big. That's the main issue with them. But their linger time is decent, so they get pushed into the coin roll. Whether that's a proper place for a light fighter to be, I think it's a good supplement. I don't think it's a good dedicated counterinsurgency aircraft. But I think having, basically the ability to attach a bunch of gun pods to a light fighter to press it into service as a kind of, close air support, I think that's valuable. What are examples of light fighters? I'm going to stick to the U.S. The F-5E Tiger, that was one we developed. We adopted it for training. The MiG-28, that might have been F5N or whatever, but basically the F5 platform, the MiG-28 in Top Gun. It's a training. It's used as training. It's used as a dissimilar aircraft to fight against, and they're small and they're huge threats. And they're actually I think it's a better aircraft than the MiG-21 even. So. Pilots love it. Chuck Yeager, the big brother of that, the F-20 Tiger Shark, which they only produced a couple of because they basically couldn't get licensed to sell internationally. He says one of the finest aircraft he ever flew, and I tend to believe him. He's a very important Air Force person. And the F-5, considering it's in service in multiple air forces, the Iranians just debuted basically an updated version of it, and they're calling it their 4th generation or 5th generation super fighter. It's just a modified F-5 from basically the airframes that they had from, I guess it was before the 70s Shah was overthrown. It's just a good plane. It's really useful. The U.S., we deploy them in training, and we don't really use them for air like National Guard or Air Forces. And the reason we don't is because we have the F-16. Now, the F-16 was actually competing with the F-17, which is called the Cobra, which is basically a tinier version of the F-18. And the F-16 is called the Viper. So the F-16 Viper was basically not the cheapest aircraft to operate, but very, very cheap, particularly compared to something like the F-15. It's smaller than the F-15. It's faster in a straight line than the F-15, and it's more maneuverable than the F-15. That's why the Air Force Thunderbirds, they use the F-16 and not the F-15, because the F-16 so a lot more maneuverable, a lot more fancy. And the big thing about it is it's a lot cheaper to operate. So, really successful for international sales and whatnot. What did they do to it, the F-15 Viper? Well, they turned it into the Fighting Falcon. They pressed it into multi-role service. It kind of does multi-role okay, but now you've taken this fast, lean, light aircraft and you've weighed it down with tons of drop tanks and payloads and air-to-ground and heavy stuff and bombs, like lots of stuff to basically make sure it has enough payload to be a serviceable multi-role fighter. And now it's not a good light fighter, because if you have all that stuff on it, it's just not. It's not going to be able to maneuver and do all the things that a light fighter does, and it's going to have a bigger radar signature. We have the F-16V now, which is it's got kind of a bigger neck. You'll see running down. It does look distinctly different than the F-16. Word is that thing's more capable in every way than the basically any of the previous F-16 models were, and they're so confident they've gone back to calling it the Viper. Will it function as a light fighter for the U.S. military? I don't know. I don't know if it'll work as a light fighter. Is it going to be cheaper to operate than the F-22? Yes. Will it be cheaper than the F-15EX? Probably. Does it fill the role of light fighter versus just being multi-role? I'm not sure. And I think we should probably adopt a second light fighter. Either, bring back some sort of variant of the Tiger Shark, because the F5 is amazing, or go with something like the Textron Airland Scorpion. If you look that thing up, it's basically a commercial Cessna that's been configured to be a fighter jet. It's made completely from off-the-shelf parts. It's completely modular, so the military can put in the stuff they want. It's supersonic, but it's not like super duper fast. It's not fast like the F-16 is. So, and I think it kind of complements the F-16. It's the kind of thing where like the Air National Guard could operate, or a Civil Guard could operate, because it's a very cheap aircraft. It costs a fraction of what even the F-16 costs to operate. I think we should look into having something that's like that, particularly on the National Guard level. We'll see. Maybe the 16 fills that doctrine. Maybe basically attack helicopters are going to be more capable enough to kind of do sort of what the light fighters would be doing otherwise. I don't know. I think maybe a cheap, small stealth aircraft for a light fighter role. Basically a stealthy F-16, maybe a little smaller even. That would be kind of nice. I don't know how cheap that would be to operate. I mean, it would be cheaper than a Raptor or an F-35, right? I don't know. There's a lot of argument about the viability of light fighters, but I like them because I think they plug holes in air defense doctrine. So that's a light fighter, basically. If it's small, might be quick, but it's hard to spot, and it's cheap to operate. That's what the role of a light fighter is.